It's my distinct pleasure to introduce two esteemed scholars and colleagues of mine. I've known both for a number of years and benefited greatly from their scholarship, their research, and their knowledge. Our first speaker, Dr. Rob Johnson, is the director of the Changing Character War program at Oxford University. He is also the senior research fellow of Pembroke College at Oxford. Our second speaker, Dr. Sibylle Scheipers, is the director of the Institute for the Study of War and Strategy at St. Andrews University, where she is also a senior lecturer in the School of International Relations. Both speakers have written extensively on various aspects of war's changing character, from its many institutions to the relationships within and among those institutions, and how those changes and relationships affect the conduct of war. So, both of them are therefore highly qualified to help us think through the broader implications for the changing character of war, which, as some have it, may actually not be changing. So we'll perhaps debate that a little bit today. So Rob will share his observations about linkages between our challenges and the way we ought to think about those challenges. And Sibylle will talk about the relationship between war and the law of armed conflict. Rob, please.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm always surprised, as an Englishman, ever to be invited back to the United States. There was that sort of unpleasantness back in the 1770s, but it seemed to have worked out quite well for you. Well done. I have actually a new appreciation of the word independence now that Britain has Brexited. But I did I thought it was an observation to make, actually, that the European Union, in an attempt to mend bridges recently, said to the British, we'll have you back. Now, you may not realise how offensive that may be to us right now, but if you can imagine that if I was to say to you, in light of the difficulties that you might be having with a certain controversial new president, if Republican democracy doesn't work out for you, we'll have you back. Since I want to get out here alive, I'll very quickly move on and just give a quick shout out to Syndicate 3 for probably putting me up to that. I think what I'd like to do is just try to help us to bring together the conference in some way and to ask the question, how do we think about change? More importantly, how do we organise for change? How do we think through armed conflict today, and particularly its strategic implications? What framework should we be using to understand complex situations and what is changing and which continuities still matter? There is much speculation, naturally, about the present and the near future. And we've had presentations about the tools and techniques and systems which seem to be flavour of the month. A greater emphasis on cyber, robotics, new air systems, autonomy, and devices which might be used by violent non-state actors. But why do we choose these? Why was it that, for example, panel 2 was about technology? Well, I think in many ways, as the Greeks would say, we have to know thyself. You have to know who you are. And as an outsider looking in to the United States, it's very interesting how much technology dominates the literature and the discourse in this country about modern war. It reflects, of course, in part your history, where engineering was naturally one of the most important features of the building of your country. And, of course, an advantage that you won in large-scale industrial war and by large-scale industrialization. But I think the second thing about you, which has come up, funnily enough, this morning, is the importance of law. People have referred to a rules-based international order, missing, of course, the oxymoron about the word order. International relations is not ordered, and it is at heart rather anarchic. But that law, that idea, means that we are deeply offended by polities or actors that break international norms and laws, and we are very eager to protect the people. That is natural and understandable. But we are attacked here in the United States in particular ways precisely because the United States is so strong in the conventional combat activity. We live, we are told, in an age of uncertainty and a period of rapid transformation. But we have always lived in an era of uncertainty and rapid transformation. As I've tried to illustrate with this slide, if one was to just reflect for a moment on not just the military transformation of the United States Army between 1901 and 1917, for example, but if one also thought about the United States changing strategic posture, just think how short those years actually are and how dramatic those shifts really were. In 1917, naturally enough, the United States chose to fight Germany. By 1947, Germany was now, or at least West Germany, was firmly an ally. In 1945, the Soviet Union had, of course, been a key ally against Nazi Germany, but by 1949, just on the other side of that boundary, clearly it was an implacable enemy, and so it goes on. And if we put on our modern time frame, here we are in 2017, think how much has changed since 2001, and how profoundly, if we were to map the same kind of schema, things will change by 2047, or indeed 2067. By then, all my body parts will be replaceable and made of plastic. History, the point I'm making is not so much, that history repeats itself. I'm not saying that at all, but merely that it's a very useful framework for thinking about how decisions were reached strategically and helps us to ask ourselves critical questions about how we approach the future. We do tend to see patterns of activity, just as this little schema in front of you does. And then we try to seek out the novel. It's a particular American characteristic to look for novelties, gadgetry, and technological innovation. But what we tend to do is miss out the legacies, the relics, and the continuities. So how well is the United States prepared? People always talk to me about movies. I have not seen World War Z, but I wonder how you're going to get on with World War T, as in your president's name. But let's move on to what our adversaries are saying about you and what outsiders are saying about you and how you are preparing. Kvachav was the former GRU head and, of course, now is has been the commander last year of the Special Purposes Force, and wrote that a new type of war has emerged in which armed warfare has given up its decisive place in the achievement of military and political objectives of war to another kind of war, to information war. And there are members of the Russian General Staff who believe they are already at war with the United States. That terminology, war, of course, is slightly problematic, but it's worth hanging on to that thought for a moment. In their conception, there are no pre-war hostilities, no pre-war phase, just as we were hearing yesterday. Conflict is continuous, and their objective is to try to seize the initiative. They will use all means and all assets and have no problem with that, and will operate in all dimensions. They will try to exploit your propensity for strategic impatience. Short electoral cycles means the decisions have to be made fairly quickly in strategic terms. And they wish to achieve their strategic political objectives by getting a longer-term planning process, pushing you into a particular space where they know that you're going to behave, and then try to tripwire you into hasty decisions. And if they can't get compliance, they're quite interested in regime change. In this information war age, the nature clearly doesn't change. We're trying to render our opponent compliant to our will, as somebody famous once said. I think that's also about thinking, though. Willpower isn't just about motivation, it's how we think. And if the character of those types of conflicts are not really about territorial control by military occupation in the old sense, it does still matter that populations are protected and along with it a nation's wealth and its infrastructure. I think the deduction we might reach from that is that war is fought in the minds of men. It's certainly an idea which the Russians are taking up very seriously. The objective of war is to change the enemy's mind, to persuade him perhaps that he is already defeated. And of course, this is now done, in many ways, by control of inputs or information, or alternatively, by presenting us with a ground truth. This brings me neatly to this idea of cyber as well, of which we hear an enormous amount. Cyber can be conceived of as quite an old idea, three older elements of communication, sabotage, and espionage or intelligence. I would ask you the question, if that is what cyber is today, these three elements now combined. Oh yeah, that's great. Well, that's work. Right. I would ask the question, which element do we tend to focus on the most? In the literature, the focus is on the sabotage component, the denial of service attack, the cyber Pearl Harbor. Sometimes there's an equal amount of literature written about mass communications and social media's ability to mobilize populations. We spend rather less time on espionage and intelligence components, although it does get mentioned. If we were to take the Second World War, however, and test out the strategic significance of each of these effects, would we still come to the same conclusion? Was the operation, for example, by OSS in World War II of sabotage strategically the most significant component of that activity? Or was it mass communication, mobilizing the American public for war? Or was it, in fact, the intelligence breakthroughs that were made in the middle of the Second World War, which gave the United States an unprecedented advantage over both Japan and, indeed, Nazi Germany? We heard a lot yesterday, critically, about the so-called hybrid war, or potentially unrestricted warfare idea. And hybrid war has generated a vast literature, such that I can't quite keep up with it. But what it does, of course, is it reveals more about Western and American anxieties about our unpreparedness compared with the recent past of how we conduct these kind of operations. It is, of course, a tactic which can be countered by strategic methods, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and so on. Russia, of course, is using it not to simply harass you. They're using it to buy time for their military modernization program, particularly in fires, automated systems, reversionary modes, nuclear operations. And they aren't due to be ready until 2020 or 2021, just in time for Donald Trump's second term. They may well use certain ways and means to achieve their strategic ends, and information warfare, you can guarantee, will be a pretty important part of that. In terms of areas of concern, though, looking into the United States, we've mentioned cyber and hybrid or unrestricted warfare, but mega cities have not been mentioned as prominently as I thought they might over the last 24 hours. We know that tactical and operational warfighting in cities is costly and destructive and fixes maneuverist forces. And tactical solutions are being evolved at the moment across NATO and in the US in terms of better intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, precision fires, raiding, and, as we heard yesterday, robotics with cyber interdiction, isolation of areas, and intelligence-led low-intensity operations. But, of course, if you're in Iran or Russia or Syria, it is overwhelming fires that are dominating the way they approach urban operations. And if we were to turn the problem around of our concern or our fear of warfare in urban centres, we might actually recognize that Russia and Syria and China are much more worried about the phenomenon of mass mobilization and social media than we are. What approaches should we take to the future of war and the changing character of war as it emerges in the next few years? Should we look at prediction? Well, we know that's a pretty unreliable yardstick. Scenarios, they're good, but we never know if we're choosing quite the right ones. Historical models or concepts can be useful, but history doesn't repeat itself. And modelling has its own artificial limitations. Currently, I would argue there are three major interpretations or schools of thought in approaching how we think through the near future and the character of war. They tend to fall in the category of terrorism, those who favour technologies, and those who are far more, shall we say, traditional. On the terrorism front, we have been confronted by the spectacular 9/11 style attacks around the world. You may also know of the swarm attack tactic used in places like Mumbai, with only 5 fighters that brought a city to a standstill. And we're now confronted by the prospect of 200-man swarm attacks. And, of course, much of the literature is dominated by weapons of mass destruction, how they might be used by terrorist groups. On the technology front, We also have a lot of discussion about automation, AI, cloaking, stealth, surveillance, body enhancements. We heard about a lot of that this morning. But does it change your thinking if you think of human beings themselves as a type of technology, which, when combined and synchronized, produce all sorts of new possibilities? And what about the traditional approaches to the changing character of war? In the United Kingdom, we have a document called Global Strategic Trends, which boldly sets out where we're going over the next 30, 40 years. And one of the things that comes up in that document is the prevalence we can expect of state failure, state fragility, and the failures of states. But states have always been failing and have been remade. What we may be confronted by is far more stability operations that we don't really favour at all. There will, of course, be important continuities. Civil wars will continue to rage in different parts of the world. And it is worth remembering, despite all our obsession with technology, that most people in the developing world in civil wars are killed by assault rifles, machine guns, and IEDs, not by these high-tech weapon systems. Wars are still determined, the traditionalists would argue, by force, mass, and resources. And ultimately, war is, as we heard, repeated again this morning, war is ultimately a human endeavour. The qualities and frailties of humans are played out. As the Gurkhas often say, friends are good on the day of battle. But I tell you what, it still hurts when you lose some of your friends in war. Let's notice too, however, recent trends and how they influence our thinking. It's all very well having global strategic trends, but they can corral our thinking and give us sort of comfortable and acceptable, palatable truths we can hang on to. Major war, for example, is thought to be unthinkable, and therefore it is assumed to be unlikely. That was challenged pretty robustly this morning. Our frames of reference, of course, always tend to influence our deductions. As the British political scientist and historian E.H. Carr once said, we are locked in our own flux of history, and it's very difficult to try and escape from it. So what type of war is the United States actually preparing for? And is that type of war the one it wants, not the one it's going to get? Our political leaders want the protection of populations because they can't sell the idea of destruction to the electorate, as Britain found over Libya in 2011. We can be sure, I think, that future warfare is unlikely to be merely an extension of warfare in the present, being somehow limited with guaranteed air supremacy and low casualties. We have to confront the fact that war for us in the future is going to be a very bloody business indeed. So how do we continue to think critically about this subject and challenge assumptions? I think we need critical questions. This is only one slide from a list that I've been compiling with colleagues, people who work in politics in the UK and some colleagues here in the United States, to say, what are the questions, the critical questions we must be asking at the strategic level, both by military officers and indeed by our political masters? We need to understand war, Professor Sir Hugh Strachan reminded us, because many of our political leaders simply haven't got the bandwidth to dedicate that time to the study that we have got the time to study. We are unlikely, it seems to me, to be able to change government organisation for war in the information age here in the United States. So asking those critical questions will at least allow military professionals and professional political leaders to engage in a dialogue on equal terms. Where are we headed, though? There's a rather lot of detail in this slide, but the idea of it is to say that we are moving already from an information era into a synthetic era. Time and distance are being ever shortened. And all of these transformations, technological and organisational, will only be effective, I would argue, if we were able to blend them with something far more fundamental about what doesn't change, that war is about politics. It is coercive. It is about the exercise of power, and we mustn't quail from that ultimate reality. There will always be friction. Robots will always let you down. Soldiers will often feel scared on the battle space. We have to just accept that that's the way it's going to be. I think we can blend some of these ideas of the unchanging nature and the changing character that we've been hearing about over the last day and we can express them quite often as concepts. I haven't got time to go through them now, but Parameters was very kind and generous and allowed me to publish an article back in 2014 called Predicting Future War, and how these concepts might be played out, and those, of course, you may recognise them. What we have to be careful about, though, and we were reminded about this point yesterday by Professor Strawn, in the past, we have often clung on to particular values or a military culture and techniques and sometimes even equipment which have long outlived their usefulness. We have suppressed unpalatable truths and condemned them as mad or sensationalist. Some things don't change. The need for personal and collective resilience in war, the need to motivate troops, and as you so brilliantly exercise here at this college, effective leadership really matters. So how do I bring this together? My deductions are essentially that every age is an age of uncertainty. The temptation is to fall back on the familiar, especially physical things, even when we think and we know deep down they're no longer appropriate for the task at hand. We tend to see things in patterns, rather like that schema I put up of the last 100 years. So it's important that we ask critical questions to free ourselves from the flux of history to which we belong. We tend to be over-optimistic or overly pessimistic and very selective about what it is that we wish to study or believe or invest in. We can use, I think, history for experience to convert some of the uncertainty to a framework for thinking through new problems. And to that end, I pay a lot of attention to this gentleman. For those who don't know, is Thomas Edward Lawrence, or so-called Lawrence of Arabia, who was not a guerrilla leader, by the way. He was on an advise and assist mission with the Arab forces in Arabia in 1917, 1918. But amongst his many interesting observations, deeply flawed man though he was, he did notice that war consists of three interesting elements. War is algebraic, it is bionomic, and is diethetic. Now, despite the pomposity of those remarks, algebraic meaning it is physical. It is about physical things, it is about mass, it's about numbers and equipment. It is bionomic, as in it's about food, water, and rest. Every service person needs to sleep at some point in the middle of a war. It's also diethetic. In other words, what's going on in the mind, both the mind of your own forces and the mind of the enemy. I think we should think not so much about physical things, the algebra of war, but what to make the enemy think, what to make the enemy know, and what we want them to essentially do. Today, we might add to this list, if Lawrence was alive today, he would probably suggest we should add in three more terms, that war is esoteric, it is egotistic, and it is now increasingly synthetic. I'm happy to explain some of that later on if you like. Is the United States ready for the forms of conflict that are coming up over the horizon? Yes, I think physically you are ready for the first phase of the next war, whatever it is that it's thrown at you. But it is only by thinking, questioning, and ultimately changing rapidly that we can survive, prevail, and win. That is, of course, the history of our species. As we now like to say in Britain post-Brexit, keep calm and carry on. Thanks.
Sibylle?
My slideshow just behind after.
Let's see, just keep going. Oh, no, keep going.
No.
Sorry, they shouldn't be on there.
Oh, here we go. That looks reassuring. Yeah.
Some groans in the audience over clouds with Carl. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I obviously have a very tough brief to follow because Rob is just so much funnier than I am. We all know, Germans and humor don't mix. And plus, I mean, German history is more complicated than English, British and US relations. It's possible to joke about German history, but I think it requires more subtlety than my jet-lagged mind is now able to muster. So, without any further ado, to the matter in hand. So, what I want to address in the next 20 minutes or so is the impression that the law of armed conflict in particular, has become increasingly politicized over the past decades. What I'm going to do is I will run you through the evolution of the law as it happened over the past 1.5 centuries. And my main point will be to demonstrate and argue that the law of armed conflict has always been politicized to a certain extent since its very inception. What has changed, I would say, is that the number of actors who are empowered to use the law for their political purposes has increased, and that has rattled actors, particularly in the West, who used to be at the longer lever of making the laws and imposing them on others. Let me just preface my remarks with an important caveat. When I talk about the politicization of the law of armed conflict, I'm not in any way trying to convey the idea that individual officers or soldiers have a kind of cynical approach to the law or would politicize the law for their individual and personal purposes. What I'm talking about is a much more sort of structural level that integrates political processes and that goes way beyond the level of the individual, even though the individual will have to deal with the consequences of these processes. Right. Good. So I know that Clausewitz has been sort of much maligned, but also much referred to over the past two days. I'm going to start with him. He didn't have a very high opinion of the law, as I will explain in a second, and that was, to a certain extent, that had to do with his idea of the nature of war. And the nature of war, as has quite often been mentioned, is war is a clash of wills, and as such, it tends towards escalation. And as such, it is sort of contra the idea of any kind of inbuilt limitation. So he writes in On War that the philosophy of war can never accommodate a principle of constraint without becoming absurd. That is certainly his first definition of war. And quite in line with this, you will all be probably familiar with his rather dismissive remarks about the law of armed conflict, that they don't really pose any constraints, that they are rather weak, that the limitations emanating from international legal custom rarely ever weaken the force of law and its tendency to escalate towards ever-increasing degrees of violence. However, war in reality, as Clausewitz later in his career discovered, is not always escalating towards extremes, towards absolute war. It quite often remains limited. But the reason why war is limited does not have so much to do with the law of armed conflict, especially not in Clausewitz's time. You may agree with him on that. But Clausewitz discovered that it was effectively politique, or politics even, that limits war. Now, obviously, the law of armed conflict evolved in its codified form, largely evolved after Clausewitz's lifetime. So you might argue that he's a sort of unlikely starting point for an exploration of the relationship between law and war. And certainly the first step towards the codification of the law of armed conflict was Francis Lieber's Lieber Code of 1863. Now, Lieber is an interesting case because he is, to my knowledge, the first thinker who approaches the law of armed conflict or the constraints that the customs of war might pose by introducing the notion of military necessity. And that's a very interesting notion, as we shall see. So what does he mean by military necessity as the principal limit on violence in war? Well, he means that violence is justified as long as it serves a military purpose, an intended aim. So it cannot be gratuitous. It cannot be for the fun of enjoying violence or something. It cannot be sadistic, if you will. However, Lieber himself was rather pessimistic about the power that the law in itself would generate. So on the one hand, I mean, we might still interject with Clausewitz, well, but violence tends to create its own purposes. Certainly it is sort of, it is tempting to terrorize certain populations, as was obviously part of his own lifetime, Lieber's lifetime experience during the American Civil War. But also that violence tends to create, well, as I said, violence tends to create its own purposes. Revenge comes into the picture as well. So what is sort of strictly military necessary is up to the combatant's definition and point of view. And even Lieber himself was quite pessimistic about to what extent soldiers in the field would really accept legal constraints as constraints, or whether they would not simply ignore them in the heat of battle. Now, the further evolution of the codified law of armed conflict and the way in which it was interpreted certainly took the idea of military necessity a step further than Lieber had intended, really. The Imperial Germany was famous for this idea that Kriegsraison geht vor Kriegsmanier, which means that military necessity basically trumps the customs and the laws of war. I haven't found any source of where this kind of idea came from. You could study, I mean, Helmut von Moltke the Elder certainly reflects it partly in some of his remarks when he says that the greatest kindness is in war is bringing it to a speedy conclusion. Interestingly, he also points to the notion of military necessity that cannot be restricted to military aims as such. It has also to accommodate or to include political necessity, if you will. In the end, military necessity or the accommodation of military aim is nothing if it doesn't fall in line with a political aim as well. And so in this vein, he wrote that you must attack all the resources of the enemy's government, its finances, its railways, its stores, even its prestige. So that certainly points towards an escalatory dynamic that is at work, and that cannot be reined in or hedged by the laws of war. And hence, this Kriegsraison geht vor Kriegsmanier implies that in times of war, or in times of extreme military necessity, the laws of war are effectively suspended. So there is no balance of military necessity and humanity. It's just that humanity goes out of the window, if need be. Now, the German idea and the discourses on the law of armed conflict were seriously debated, even though they were highly critically debated between the end of the 19th century and the end of the Second World War. Many people refuted Moltke's and others' ideas that military necessity trumps the laws of armed conflict. And this idea was certainly finally, definitively put to rest in the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, that made it very clear in its rulings that no amount of military necessity or no amount of pressure in war can suspend the law of armed conflict, really. Now, so after the Second World War, we end up with a situation in which the law of armed conflict is accepted as an instrument, as a body of law that effectively accommodates two very kind of contrasting elements. So the law of armed conflict has to balance military necessity and humanities. Those are the two prongs that the law has to deal with. Now, over the past half century, I would say, there has certainly been the impression that the scales, the sliding scales of military necessity and humanity have slided too far towards the end of humanity, and that military necessity has been rather crowded out and has been ever more constrained. And this impression was quite often accompanied with the notion that the law has become increasingly politicized. This idea of the politicization of the law was mainly due to the fact that many of the actors who were involved in interpreting the law and in pushing forward new codifications of new treaties were not state actors that were mainly involved in making the law during the Hague Conference of 1899 and 1907 and the Geneva Conferences of 1949, but that there was also sort of an increasing activism at play here on the part of non-state actors, NGOs, courts who were interpreting, courts and war crimes tribunals who were putting forward with very kind of idiosyncratic or even aspirational interpretations of the law. And also, crucially, the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who has taken it upon itself to produce studies on customary international law, which quite often have been criticized as pushing the envelope too far, not effectively reflecting what is really customary law, but presenting something that is an aspiration, and that the legal constraints have become too tight in a way. And I think from this impression arose the notion of lawfare. So this idea that due to the ever-increasing constraints put on the use of force and the ever-decreasing weight given to the role of military necessity, the law has effectively become militarized, it has become weaponized, and that is what is at the heart of the notion of lawfare. Now, I would like to present a slightly different take on this idea of the politicization of the law. What is remarkable is that the law of armed conflict was dominated, well, that Western states effectively had a hegemony over the law of armed conflict until 1977, when Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2 were adopted. To a certain extent, the Western hegemony over the law of armed conflict had already come to an end in 1949 with the Geneva Conventions and the multiplication and proliferation of new states who are now becoming actors in the process of codifying the law and making the law. But it was even more pronounced in 1977 and in the years after that as new war crimes tribunals, war crimes jurisdictions, and sort of civil society activism increased. If we focus on the area after 1977 and point our finger on this era and say, well, this is really where the politicization of the law of armed conflict started, The risk is that we tend to overlook that the law was, of course, always infused with political motives. And that is unsurprising to a certain extent because the law was made by states, and states would, of course, try and pursue their own interests when making the law. If we, for instance, look back at the Hague Conventions, we can see the political struggle over the law at play in a formidable way. Germany and Russia, as the two big land powers at the time, were very adamant that they wanted to keep the definition of lawful belligerency, so who can claim belligerent privilege, very closely aligned with what regular armies looked like, because they were big land powers that would favor their own military strength. Whereas countries like, for instance, the Benelux states, who were very small and traditionally did not have much of a standing army and had to rely for their own self-defense on militia forces, would be sort of suffer a disadvantage from this kind of definition. So much so that the British delegate to the Hague Conference criticized that the Hague Convention would in its sort of draft status, would look like a code for conquest. And in the end, obviously, Germany and Russia prevailed with that. What we also have to keep in mind is that, quite contrary to the idea that the law is always a constraining force when it comes to the use of violence, the law was quite often used to justify extreme military measures, and not necessarily by military leaders, but quite often by policymakers. We only have to look at the sort of large-scale bombing of civilians during the Second World War, or, for instance, more recently, the debate about torture and detention, to see how, if political actors want to justify extreme measures, I might say, or rather, not very constrained, not very limited measures in war, they don't usually say, they don't usually go down the German route and say, well, in times of war, military necessity trumps the law of war. What they quite often do these days is to harness the law, or rather a particular interpretation of the law, into their own plans, political and military. So where does that leave us? I think what I've tried to get across is that the law of armed conflict is and always has been politicized. I think we cannot get away from that. And certainly, the concept, I think what we have to keep in mind is here that the concept of lawfare is not so much an expression of the fact that this politicization is a new phenomenon, but it effectively reflects that the politicization, the spectrum or the dynamic or the possibility, the potential of politicizing the law has been made available to an ever-increasing number of actors who are not necessarily Western actors, but who are quite often non-state actors, or countries that are not part of any kind of Western alliance or coalition, who might quite often be enemies of NATO, of the US, of the UK, or other Western states. So I think where I want to go with this is that the charge of lawfare is a difficult one, because what we actually complain about is a sort of nostalgia for a more imperial law of armed conflict, for an era where it was the West or other powerful states who would dictate the law to other lesser powers. And I think what we have to really become clear about is that there is no going back to that. There would be no political legitimacy for that. And a hegemonic version of the law of armed conflict is certainly, I think, is not what people have in mind when they are talking about a rules-based international order. They would have to spend, I think, a lot more military force on enforcing or imposing these laws on those who are then on the receiving end that they would be willing to spend. Interestingly, I think what is also fascinating about this idea of the politicization of the law is that the law and the notions that come from the law of armed conflict have probably become a sort of lingua franca that might open up a space for strategic dialogue and strategy making. If you think about notions like target, if you think about the notion of military necessity itself, that is a notion that emanates from the law, that comes from the law, and yet it is, I believe it is being used by military planners both on the political side and on the military side. So we cannot get away from the law, otherwise we would partly lose our language, really, our strategic language. What that also means, finally, is that, returning to Clausewitz, obviously, here, if the law of armed conflict is politicized, what we can deduct from that is then that it is effectively part of the political limitation of war. The law is often accused, or policymakers are often accused of enforcing the law selectively, but that, of course, just reflects their selective political interests. Do I have another slide? No. Okay, so I think the upshot of all this is, as I said, I mean, there is no return to the age of imperial law. I think what we have to consider, to ponder, to discuss is the question of how can the West operate in an era where it has lost the hegemonic ability to impose Western-made laws on other actors or other states. And possibly, the option that it is positive that there is no Western hegemony over the law of armed conflict anymore, because it might open up the endorsement of the law of armed conflict. Our opponents, effectively making reference to the law of armed conflict, opens up a space that might create a normative background that is part of that rules-based international order that I think we are all searching for in a way. But we cannot hang on to this kind of illusion that a rules-based international order is all good and well, but only if it's us who make the rules. Thank you.
Right, now we'll switch into question and answers, and as a chair, I will take the exercise my prerogative to ask the first question, which is the so what question, which is essentially the character of war changing or not as much. Lots of things go into it. There's no consensus really on what that is. There's no consensus over what war itself is necessarily. There's little consensus really on what strategy is necessarily. So given the lack of consensus, does any of that prevent us from asking the right questions as we begin to develop strategy? Does it help us or prevent us from winning? Does it matter, in other words? So it's not meant to be a trick question, but then again, perhaps there's a twist or two in there.
There might well be. I must admit, I read with great interest, and many of you probably have as well, Sir Lawrence Freedman's book, his mammoth sort of tome on strategy. And, Sir Lawrence sort of ends with a sort of fairly pessimistic tone, it seems to me, that, we're all wasting our time a lot of the time, thinking that we can do it. And yet, when impressed, he also refers to the idea that, you can set out your political stall, you can set out your values, you can create an impression in the mind of your opponent. You can set milestones by which you wish to achieve certain objectives. And I think that at least those components, which remain consistent, are the most valuable reasons why we should continue to think about strategy. I mean, many of you will be familiar with the expression that strategy isn't a plan, it's the process of planning somehow. And I struggled for a long time to try and really understand what that meant, because I'm a bearer of red letter brain. But I wanted to, I think I understand it's being, it's the critical dialogue that you go through with your collective group, be that both political and military, hopefully, and we've been reminded many times that that has to always include the public. It has to be this trinity of the three. That critical dialogue and that constant dialogue is where the real action is, the real heat, and that's where the real value is. It's not the product, it's not the fact you have a national security strategy at the end that matters so much. It's the process that you've been through in that decision-making elite.
Okay, fair enough.
That was an inadequate answer for a question.
No, it's a start, though. Questions from the floor? Yes. Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm still Sidney Friedberg. A question for both of you. One of the things that's emerged throughout this conference and for the last several years is the idea of war in the gray zone of unrestricted conflict below the threshold, which doesn't comport with traditional strategic or legal concepts. And I'm curious, how your frameworks help us deal with that, to figure out, what that is. Perhaps the Chinese short-selling our debt would not be an act of war. Perhaps it would be. And to recognize what's happening and to respond in an effective way.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I'm minded to cite Lord Horatio Kitchener, who was the gentleman charged with running the counterinsurgency campaign in South Africa between 1900 and 1902. And he is on record for having complained about the Afrikaner sort of fighters by saying, they open up on us from their little koppies, jump on their ponies, and rather unsportingly ride away. Instead of standing for a good fight, like a British soldier would do on the fields of Saratoga. Look how well that went. I think, if I may say, there's a confusion here between tactics, which is what you're describing, and strategy. And we mustn't confuse the two. They are in a relationship with each other, and we've found that all the time. They always have been. There's no difference there. But I think, rather like Kitchener was confusing the tactical problem he faced with the overall requirement, which Alfred Lord Milner, the High Commissioner of South Africa, or Cape Town, became South Africa, realised was that you have to come up with a grand bargain in the end if you're going to strategically end that conflict in a satisfactory way. And it was so successful, by the way, the grand bargain in 1902, that South Africa, the majority of South Africans joined the First World War willingly and fought very distinguished in that conflict. And I think here, this business about grey zone and thresholds and whatever, if our adversary wants to play that game, why must we feel obliged to play the same game as them? Would it not be better to allow them to fiddle around with this nonsensical kind of concept and break the law whilst we concentrate on the strategic responses to, I think the modern kind of colloquialism is to call out the enemy for what they're doing. I think that just means show them up and embarrass them. But we must concentrate other tools on the problem set and not get drawn into the very game that Russia and other people want us to play. That'd be my approach.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm going to concentrate on the law of armed conflict. Quite often there is this impression that the law is outdated; it cannot keep up, and that's what's been quite often said over the past 2 days. That the new developments, as in cyber warfare, in robotics, technological challenges, and that the law is just constantly kind of trying to keep up, but just can't. It's just constantly behind the curve. Yes, I think that I can share the impression, but the reason for why that is happening is not so much a legal reason. I think it would be possible to regulate set out a legal framework that applies in the cyberspace. I think, again, it is for political reasons. I mean, if we, for instance, look at one of the takeaways from Iraq and Afghanistan, that was certainly that the detention regime was a very big trouble and a big issue that undermined interoperability, particularly in Afghanistan among NATO allies. And quite rightly, after this experience, NATO and other countries have kicked off what is known as the Copenhagen process, which is supposed to set out sort of understandings of the law and new best practice in the legal area, especially when it comes to detention. Interestingly, when you look at the document produced in the Copenhagen process, what it often refers to is the applicable law. Now, the applicable law differs considerably between NATO allies because, of course, the US has not ratified additional Protocol 1, whereas all European NATO members did do so. But even among European NATO members, the reservations they put down on the ratification of additional Protocol 1 are quite extensive. So there is no unified applicable legal framework here, and that has not materialized for political reasons, not because it would not be legally possible to create one. So I think if we want to tackle the legal problem, we would have to start with the political one.
You're as knackered as we are.
Yes, in the middle. Thank you.
Monty Montague from Seminar 16. Dr. Johnson, can you expound upon the proposed additions to Lawrence's Trinity? I think I understand what you mean when you say egotistic as it relates to maybe nation's best interests, and synthetic might be technological. But in terms of esoteric, are you talking about being more in the hands of experts, which seems counter to some of the conversations we've had earlier about expanding the conversation, the national conversation as it relates to strategy?
Actually, I really rather like your interpretation. So I left it deliberately ambiguous because, of course, first of all, Lawrence would have probably never said anything so absurdly simplistic as I said. But I mean, I guess I'm getting at is egotistic because, as was mentioned this morning, there's this anxiety that highly developed societies, which are very connected, very wired, we would say, seem to be becoming more atomized or more siloed. I think that was the expression this morning. And that is an anxiety. And if warfare is becoming sort of possible for empowered individuals with malicious intent in a way that we haven't seen with the same magnitude of effect before, well, certainly not for a long time, that would be pretty considerable. Esoteric because one of the problems we face is that there are groups of people around the world, despite all the promises of secularism, rationalism, and the Enlightenment, who insist on waging war with a form of fanaticism that we find unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable with. Although, as one American general said, this is the perfect kind of war. They want to die and we want to kill them. So you take your turn on that one. I think on the synthetic, one of the big challenges we face, caused by these new technologies, is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern what is real from what is unreal. We talk about fake news. I won't mention the other alternative facts, but you know what I'm getting at. But we've got groups of people around the world, even when they know the truth, don't want to believe it anymore and would prefer to believe in something else. People have done this for decades. Let's face it, people read the newspapers that usually reflect their own political persuasion. They silo themselves in all sorts of different ways around the world. That's not new. I'm not suggesting this is new. But I think as a manifestation within war, it could be problematic and it could indicate some of the things we need to start thinking about far more carefully than perhaps been evident in the past. But great question. Great. I like your ideas. We should talk more.
Yes, in the back.
On the laws of James Mancius, Seminar 22. On the laws of armed conflict, we seem that these laws are based on universal values, perhaps. Could you comment on sort of the perhaps transition in power, the weak suffer what they must, role of how these universal values may not be universal and how the laws of armed conflict may change in the future?
Interesting question. I mean, universal values, we tend to we tend to associate with human rights and not so much with the law of armed conflict. I think when I think about the law of armed conflict, the first, especially when you study how it came into being, the first association that comes to mind is Bismarck's famous quip about the two things that you don't want to know about how they are made. One is sausages and the other is laws. That was Bismarck, wasn't it?
For sure.
Yes, good. I think, no, let me rephrase it like this. I think in the beginning, the start-out process, the starting point for the codification of the law of armed conflict was essentially seeing the law of armed conflict as an extension of military power. I mean, quite importantly, the law of armed conflict was never meant to apply in the colonies because there people had to deal with the uncivilized. So I think from the very beginning there was, with the uncivilized, I'm sorry, Rob is laughing.
No, because colonies is what we used to refer to as before it was called the United States, so we'd get careful about, we want to get out here alive, right? So
you have a military
it's going
background,
to
not I.
retreat
Okay,
from Lexington all over again.
In the beginning, the law of armed conflict was never meant to be based on universal values. It was always explicitly, proudly meant to be based on the values of the civilized nations, and those were sort of thought of as being superior, but not as universal. So I think the idea that they are based on something that is more universal is certainly something that has come into the minds of people over the past decades, and that's what I meant with leveling the legal playing field, if you will, opening up the space in which legal debates can take place and empower more actors to partake in that. That might be kind of a painful process, but I think it's a necessary one because we cannot go back to a time where the law was hegemonic.
Let me ask another question of Rob. The all-volunteer force in the U.S. military, is it setting up the United States for a two-dimensional, as opposed to a Trinitarian, way of war, moving forward, where the population is not engaged in, wrapped into the stakes at hand? And is that a weakness or a strength?
That, it sounds like it should be a straightforward answer, doesn't it? We've got used to the idea of professional armed forces and the trends of war. When one looks back at the history of war, you find periods where specialization, artificers, engineers, gunpowder specialists were required, because without those specialists, you couldn't actually conduct war. And warfare now is amazing when you look at the skill sets that are required across the piece, not just in the US Army, but across all the armed forces. One requires everything from helicopter pilots right the way through to, those, people who serve out fantastic food in DFACs in Afghanistan. You need a lot of skill sets. I mean, it is an interesting problem because the accusation is always that greater professionalism seems to distance the population from that professional force. I know there's a long history of that here in the US. There was for a long time resistance to the idea of a professional army for lots of historical, cultural reasons. I don't think it's necessarily automatic, though. I mean, I'm engaged with there's a chap who's helping me out, who's an American citizen. We've decided we're going to try and run a conference next year here in the States called simply The Experience of War, to try and to map this out for the American public, to show them what service life is actually like, warts and all, so that we start to address this possible division between the service personnel's life and that distance professionally from the public. But I think it depends where you are, of course, in the United States, but on the whole, what's been really remarkable, given that we've had two quite extended, protracted campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, is how much the American public have been behind their service people. We heard this morning, the most popular service in the, most popular element of government. That's quite a remarkable achievement, actually. And surely that betrays this idea, or, refutes this idea that there can be this distance, or this ever-growing distance because of an all-volunteer force. What we have to do, of course, is continue. You'd be pleased to hear, I would say this, wouldn't I? We have to pay the market rate to make sure we get the kind of employees we need. It may interest you to know that when Britain was employing the Indian Army, the East India Company, and I did some research on rates of pay, in southern India, the British were able to attract recruits to their cause, not because the British had some innate leadership qualities or very good doing an advise and assist mission, but because they were paying 12 times the artisan's rate of pay for every single sepoy soldier. So why wouldn't you join and stay in the old Indian Army? So maybe maybe you heard it here, 12 times the Silicon Valley income. How good does that sound?
Yeah. All right. Well, adding on to that, though, the rise of contracted forces or capabilities in the U.S. military and in Western militaries in general, to what extent does that advantage or disadvantage, given that some of the specialties that you would like to have within your professional force are migrating outside of it, and the connectivity with the populace isn't there either, because the contractors are not entirely invisible, but the casualties among them don't count quite as much as perhaps a uniformed soldier might, and because they're there for the money and all of that. So,
I agree. I think one of the difficulties, the trends we have is that there is a sort of privatization of violence going on. I have a regular debate every year in the UK at the Higher Command Staff course, the SAMS course equivalent, with somebody who comes in from a private military company, and they usually do a bit of a hard sell about how wonderful it is to be a contractor, and when you leave your military career, you should consider becoming a contractor, that kind of argument. And I think the fundamental objection, I still feel, maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, and I could quite easily be wrong about this, but it's that there is something of the professional military person who has dedicated themselves to the service of the state, has accepted the obligations of being one of the custodes, a guardian, and when the bottom line comes, even if their pay isn't coming through regularly, they will still stand and fight for the ethos of the service or the cohesion of their colleagues in combat. Contractors, the bottom line is, if there isn't a profit margin, we ain't staying. And I think that, for me, is the final arbiter, that when we farm out, there's been periods of British military history when we farmed out to civilian contractors, commissariat or logistics duties and so on, it usually ended in tears eventually, and we had to have a bit of a rethink. And I know there's a trend to cut costs and everything else, and the logisticians are often the people to perhaps suffer in that regard. But if you can't, get there fastest or the mustest, then you can't fight. So I personally against the trend.
okay, fair enough. Other questions? Yes, in the middle.
Colonel Scott Mueller, Seminar 21. I'd just like to return to this idea of LOAC, and while I don't want to discuss utility or necessity, are we at risk with the LOAC of attempting to turn war into something alien to its nature?
I don't think so. I think military necessity is still a big part of the law of armed conflict. I think if there is an impression that the limitations get stricter and stricter and tighter, so that military necessity is almost squeezed out of the picture, that comes down to political constraints rather than to military constraints. I mean, we've heard over and over again that in Afghanistan, rules of engagement were very, very tight, and especially rules for targeting by air power were very tight. But that was not for legal reasons. That was for reasons of political sensitivities of creating collateral damage. I think we have to be very discerning to, we have to be very careful to differentiate between these two. I do agree with you that when you, that in sort of everyday mundane conversations, people are very quick to point out, oh, that was a violation of the law of armed conflict. That was a war crime. Many people seem to believe that, for instance, it is illegal under all circumstances to kill civilians in war, which we all know it is not. The law of armed conflict says nothing of the sort. It imposes a proportionality test that has to fall, that has to balance humanity against military necessity. So I don't see that risk, to be honest. I think there might be areas like for instance the landmine protocol where even those states that were at the forefront of adopting it have reconsidered it. I remember being involved in a workshop in Finland about hybrid warfare, fittingly. And the Finns were reporting to us that they were scrambling to find technological solutions to build something like a landmine that would not fall within the landmine protocol. And they were just really kind of reconsidering the wisdom of adopting the landmine protocol, really. But I think on the whole, there haven't even been that many protocols ever since 1977. And you know, the additional protocols have not been ratified by many actors in the world. So effectively, what is customary law goes back to 1949. So I don't see it that way.
Dr. Echevarria, I believe we've got time for one quick question and then quick response.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like we have a question from the virtual audience. If Karl von Clausewitz were on the stage or in the audience, would he agree that the law of armed conflict has always been politicized? Or would he now observe and posit that with more and more non-state actors in failed or failing states, war has become more apolitical and asymmetric?
You know, it covers more than the law, the question, really.
I guess it does, really. Would he still say, well, I guess, I think he'd be pretty astonished about what's changed in warfare, obviously. But, I mean, what I derive from that book is a very strong sense that this is political. The problem we have, as Sir Hugh is often fond of pointing out, is the way that we translate the terms themselves. And Sibylle's made reference to the difficulty of even the word politik. Do you take it from a German philosophical translation? Do you translate it as policy, or do you translate it as politics? Or has it a sort of more sentimental sense behind it? What does it really mean? And it can, I think, possibly change in context. But I would take the view, I think I'm right saying, I'm looking at Hugh because he's the specialist here, that politics remains fundamentally important. If he was alive today, he would still say, in the end, this is a form of political action in action.
Yeah, I think one of the first things he probably would have said is that not only the law of armed conflict politicized and has always been, but so too has war. We politicize war and gain value out of that, use it as a political instrument and so forth in that regard as well. So,
Well, sorry, were you? No, you weren't.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, yes. Well, I think he would not agree that the law of armed conflict has always been politicized, because the law of armed conflict as he knew it was not a codified version of the law of armed conflict. So I think he would be surprised about that. I think he would be for him it would be a no-brainer to identify non-state actors or failed or failing states as political entities. Of course they are. Policy and politics is not the preserve of state governments. It's the preserve of armed groups as well, I would say.
all right, great, thank you.
With that, please join me in thanking this panel for closing the conference. And this will be the end of the formal portion